One of the reasons I use the Marstine text is I believe that Marstine is one of the forward-thinking individuals who, along with several other professionals, native and non-native in the museum world, are really looking at this concept of community engagement. And that, whether it be through what we would call a participatory exhibit or museum, where the community really has a strong sense of identification with what's going on at the museum and really gets involved with it, and that the museum itself is making strong efforts to involve the community. But also looking at indigenous issues related to curatorship on a global scale, because we do find some commonalities in curatorial theory and practice around the world on a global scale. And because many of the places where museums are, where there are indigenous communities, they have been subject to the same colonizing influences. So you'll find out someone who was a colony of Great Britain, that curators from Great Britain are operating under Great Britain museum theory. And so even if it's in New Zealand, which has changed recently, or if it's in Australia, or if it's in Africa, that the curators there, if they are of British descent, are operating under what they've been trained in British museums. You'll find the same thing in Canada, having been a former territory, provinces of Great Britain. That if we look at someone from France, that someone who's in Africa and they're running a museum in Africa, they're going to be operating under French museum theory. So that theory by an empire is going to affect indigenous peoples who were formerly colonized and are no longer colonized. So it's important to understand this kind of theory and why it's so important to look at global issues, because you'll find out when you start to look at this in a fit of madness, should you go on for a master's in museum studies and a doctorate, where you end up where I am, although I only have a master's, if you go on for a doctorate, that you'll find out that as you're doing more and more research, the astounding parallels of indigenous groups around the world and what they have had to deal with in the wake of colonizing powers telling their story for them. And that's one of the really important issues in this class, is that 99.999999973% of American history and in history of the indigenous peoples of this country has been told by non-natives. Someone is telling you your story for you. When you look at the amount of work that's out there, even just on the Southwest, there are more books about indigenous peoples of the Southwest. The only other place you would get that would be even close to the amount of work that was generated on people in the Southwest would probably be the Northwest coast. One of the things about the Southwest, and particularly among the Pueblo, Hopi, and Zuni, it's nice weather, but in particular, the Hopi, Pueblo, and Zuni we're seeing as being kind of this middle place in between the savage and the civilized. They were agricultural. They had domestic animals. They lived in apartment buildings. They had formalized ceremonies that in many ways fit in with the Catholic calendar. They had styles of government. The Pueblos, for example, modified their style of government very early to accommodate the Spanish hegemony. That's why you have the canes that the governors carry. And then when the United States took over New Mexico territory, Abraham Lincoln reaffirmed the power of those canes. But it does show you that impact of politics, culture, and someone telling our story for us. So it's important when we're looking at curatorial theory, whose story is being told. And that's why the work of Marstine and or the Cree, Gerald McMaster, is so important. So curators have to make pragmatic judgments about the differential power. Now this is just about paintings, of attraction of paintings placed in proximity to one another. For in any group of paintings to be hung together, there's always a hierarchy of this kind. That we, in our very nature, assign things to categories and very often a hierarchy. And it's a part of our cultural upbringing. In the States, we read from, I think I mentioned it in this class last week. If you read in English, what direction are you reading? Right to left. Or yeah, left to right. In China, it's left to right. Yeah, thank you. You can tell the caffeine hasn't set in yet. Yeah, in the States we read left to right, China, right to left. And that is a way of ordering information. We even do it with numbers. And when you hear it, it's very subtle in labels. If you hear if you hear a first world country, second world country, third world country, which is considered the most developed? First world. There are various ways we organize information, even the way we look at things. We learn this as we grow older, but even the way that we visually take information in. Very often, something that is bigger is seen as being more important. For example, when people go to the Maya sites, as well as the Toltec, the Aztec, the Olmec sites of Mexico, for example, where they were building these giant monumental pyramids. People will go to Teotihuacan and will say, this must have been the most important place in the hemisphere at that time. That shows you a kind of thinking. No, it was just really big. A lot of people went there. It didn't mean that the people of that culture thought it was the most important place. Very often, the most important places were your smallest, where only a few people could go. They were so powerful. But you show your nephew, who's 5 years old, a nickel and a dime and say, choose one. What do you think the child's going to choose? Often the nickel. Why? It's bigger. They don't know the presidents yet. We need to be aware of the way we categorize information as curators. That includes, believe it or not, where people walk when they walk in the door. There is a tendency, that's why in many malls, some of the prime place to be is not only by the entry of the mall, but you want to be on the right side, corner, or the right side as people come in. Because when people walk into a building, for some reason, they are inclined to turn right. And that's a visual ordering in a large architectural structure. That the architecture will shape our behavior. What's astounding, people will walk into a church and they can be talking really loud, and all of a sudden they walk into a church and all of a sudden they start to whisper. I see people do that when they walk into a classroom. And they walk down, all of a sudden they start to whisper. No one comes near the altar. There are so many ways that culture shapes the way that we organize and respond to information. And that includes paintings. That includes then, as you're thinking of the way people perceive the photographs and objects that you're developing for your projects. You can actually tailor how people will experience that exhibit by how you place things in relation to each other. So being aware to that minutia of detail as a curator is what sets what you do often apart from what others do. So in a world of museums, these are important cultural institutions now then, that we look at a cultural landscape. That cities themselves, where most of the museums are cultural landscapes. And for that matter now, cultural centers are part of a cultural landscape, because very often where you see cultural centers, your tribal institutions now, that tribe, by starting that culture center, has not only done something to maintain cultural practices in their own community, it's assumed that others are going to be visiting. So they are part of this landscape now. So when you go to Acoma and you go to Sky City and you go to their visitor center, it's like walking into Oz when you walk into that place. I mean, it's very well done. It's very shiny. They're aware of the visual impact. They're also aware that in many ways we perceive a culture the same way that we eat, with our eyes first. That we often encounter other people with our eyes first. Being aware of this visual part of the way we perceive this cultural landscape. That in a world of museums, culture centers and museums are part of a national identity. I mentioned when we were talking about the history of museums that very often museums were tied in critically to a nation telling its story of how great it was. You'll very rarely see a museum where a country, if it's a national museum, will say, here's where we got our asses kicked big time. It will be the victories, the wonderful things it's done, not the failures. That's in some ways that you have what can occur is a stifled critical inquiry. In other words, that sometimes issues in museums will be glossed over in favor of your more celebratory tales. There was an important exhibit called the Enola Gay. Have you ever heard of the Enola Gay? Yeah, because the bomber, that's why it was so important in the South Pacific to capture the islands that were close enough to start bombing Japan into submission. But after Okinawa, it was decided that, well, maybe they're not going to give up. And so part of Truman's rationale was that this is going to turn into, in essence, what they compared it to like the Battle of Stalingrad, where it was literally city building to city building. But the critical inquiry that could have occurred, and cultural amnesia. Because at the same time, Japan would very like to have forgotten the Bataan March, in which American prisoners, the equivalent of the Navajo Long Walk or the Cherokee Trail of Tears, but a lot more brutal. Japan would like to have forgotten that, and yet we have the Bataan Memorial here. The memorial that you'll see to Nagasaki and Hiroshima is going to look very different in Japan than it does here, based on nationalistic interests. As a curator in a cultural center, you are, in some degree, a nationalist thinker. You're saying, what a great people we are. Here's what we have achieved. To what degree are we going to engage some of these critical inquiries? Because you can retrace the Navajo Long Walk. You're not going to get the whole story. And you will hear varying opinions on an individual by the name, for example, of Kit Carson, based on your experience with Kit Carson. So, as part of what you're doing, are you educating people or are you indoctrinating them? Education is teaching people to think. Indoctrinating is teaching people to behave without thinking. It starts at a very early age, and I only need to say 3 words. I pledge allegiance. Do you know the rest of that poem? It's not a poem. That tone. Do you know the rest of it? I know that as well as I know Mary Had a Little Lamb. Or Hail Mary, if you're a Roman Catholic. Or Our Father. At a really young age, you are taught to behave without thinking. But it's not just in the United States or in a certain religion. We all have that as part of our enculturation, the way that we learn culture. But is what we are doing teaching us to think or teaching us to behave without thought? And typically, and some of what Marstine is talking about, and the reason and the rationale that she started to really engage in what I think is a very important book in museum studies, the New Museum Theory, is what was called the rhetoric, or what is often said, of salvage. All right, because cultural patrimony creates contention over history and over objects. One of the examples that Marstine mentions in the reading are what are called the Elgin marbles. Have you ever heard of the Elgin marbles? All right, they're not little circular things. They're not made out of glass, and throw them into each other. The Elgin marbles were acquired under questionable circumstance by Lord Elgin from Greece. They were important parts of the architecture in Athens. They were secreted out of Greece, and they ended up in the British Royal Museum. You can go to the museum today. You can go online, and you can see the Elgin marbles. And in the 20th century, Greece filed suit to have those marbles repatriated, brought back to Greece. And England said, no dice. They're ours. We bought them fair and square. They're ours. And they are as much a part of our culture, which has the beginnings of its democracy in ancient Greece, as you do, Greece, and we can take better care of them than you. It's still being debated today. And that's that where we're talking about contention over cultural patrimony. Patrimony, in essence, is like fathership. But in a patrilineal world, in patriarchal world, that relates to power. Ownership, control. Within that, then, is the rationale that various museums have to be able to own and display objects from other cultures. And that includes the Smithsonian. That includes the Palace of the Governors. That includes the National Museum of the American Indian. That includes the Chicago Field Museum. It includes the Museum of Natural History. And what occurs is that appropriated heritages become part of a nation's identity and a way that it tells its story. It's important that we understand museums in this country as part of the development of an American identity are strongly connected to art movements and architectural movements of the early 20th century, where various artists and anthropologists were coming to the Southwest for their Indian experience because they wanted to see native ceremonies. And so when people like Oliver Lafarge came as an anthropologist, when John Sloan came as an artist, what would become the Santa Fe and Taos School of Artists got enough power when New Mexico was still a territory disproportionate to the number of them that they could actually affect territorial policy and United States policy in the way that it dealt with indigenous tribes. It was artists in Santa Fe and Taos who helped defeat what was called the Bursum Bill. The Bursum Bill was a bill because there's a lot of encroachment that was occurring over water rights and ranching rights in New Mexico from non-natives on Pueblo territories. And the artists were able to, the ability of their voice and their imagery and their clout through the museums and the various cultural agencies in New Mexico to have that voice heard in Washington. They were very strong advocates of native rights. But they had an interest in art. So if you were just, if you were just out there with your ox, they didn't really care about you. You benefited long term, but it was part of this need to develop an arts economy. And part of the appropriated heritage is that we also have to remember that the history of this country, relative to the rest of the world, of empires, we're the new kid on the block in the United States. Of a world empire. I'm talking about people when your government makes a decision about trade policy, it affects the whole world. This country is only 200 and something years old relative to other global powers. And other parts of Europe and other parts of the world, the U.S. is kind of seen like, what it was often seen as this uncultured place. There was no past, really, for the people in the U.S. All of their important sites would have been in Europe. That, in a very real way, led to the development of national parks, heritage places, in a very real way, national museums, and the need to appropriate a history, because they could look at and claim American Indian history as part of American history now and start telling your story for you. It became an important part of appropriation. Appropriation are borrowing elements of a culture and using them yourself, very often to the misfortune or the denigration of the other culture. And that happens a lot. And that includes what occurs even in spirituality. So it's not just appropriation of land, appropriation of water, appropriation of cultural properties, intellectual properties, spiritual properties. Are you aware of the New Mexico flag and the controversy over the Zia sign? 5 points extra credit by email by Wednesday. Why is the Zia sign appropriation? What were the circumstances that led to that becoming the United States flag, or the flag of New Mexico? There are a lot of choices and consequences that you make as a curator, because objects do have an afterlife. They tell a story beyond the lives of the people who made them. And that story can be twisted and mutated by the curator and their particular vision. That's why it's so important, too, to do your research when you're looking at the objects, because in a very real way, you're affecting the way people are going to perceive those various objects. So, for example, Shandi, you're doing on a triangle with your project, which I thought was a cool idea because it's so obvious that it's invisible. So you're taking something actually old and showing a new way to present it. You are affecting perception in that way, because after people encounter that exhibit, they will never look at triangles the same way again. And that there are subjective presentations that do occur in museums as well as outdoor restorations, such as the Custer Monument. The Custer Battlefield. This guy is held up as a hero. And if we want to talk about culture memory, because there's an important architecture being built in New York City at the site of the World Trade Centers. I only need to say 9/11. And you instantly have that, if you're old enough to remember, those jets flying into the World Trade Center. This was the United States' 9/11 in 1876, because the news of Custer's defeat reached Philadelphia July 4th, 1876. What was going on July 4th, 1876? 4th of July celebration and the centennial celebration of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Culture memory. And it was this generation's 9/11. The other, we can think of another generation. August 1914. What occurs in August 1914? Because it's a 9/11, and it's not even in this country. The assassination of Archduke Ferdinand touched off the First World War in the country we now call Bosnia. So how big is the story that we're going to tell as curators? You'll find out in colonial museums, you get a very, very small picture. And that's indoctrination, where in many ways you can lie through omission. Have you ever lied to someone and told them nothing but true things? There is also a drive toward the authentic as part of curatorial theory that people like Marstine are saying this needs to be downplayed in many ways as a concern. Because what occurs when something's authentic, that it's real and truthful. But it also introduces apprehension. Like, is that really a moon rock? You can go online and find all the conspiracy theories about whether the U.S. even went to the moon. And that it was actually staged in some Hollywood parking lot. And in order to have a cultural validity to some people, it has to have been the real thing. A reproduction isn't going to do. That's not the real moon rock. That's a model. That's not the pen that Judith. And these are often what we see, and particularly in tribal cultural centers, this notion of, and that includes ethnicity. Are you a real Indian? How much? That has to do with authenticity, blood quantum. And it is a colonizing thing. Anytime you hear any tribal people talking about the 4 colors of the earth, 4 colors of human beings, that's colonized. There is not a white person on earth. There is not a red person on earth, nor a yellow, unless they have jaundice and hepatitis, or black. That is British colonial and French colonial ways of categorizing people. And one of the things that in this country, it's interesting, that people will talk about race. I'm a Mohawk. First question I'm going to hear is, how much? Are you full-blooded? So when they ask how much, I'll say $59.95 on sale. Authentic. It even comes down to race. And if you present yourself as a native curator, what are you going to need as your license? Your CIB, your license to be Indian or burn wagons. We used to call it our license, our hunting license back home. I don't want to talk about Walter today. So authenticity and objectivity are important in perception and perspective. All right, authenticity is something are real, not, and how objective, how able are we to look at something in a non-judgmental way? Because really, who determines authenticity? Right now, legally, your authenticity is determined by the United States based on that CIB. So from whose perspective is the story told, and to what degree have we become internally dominated? Internalized dominance is a very strong portrayal of power. And can we truly tell our own stories? How objective can we be when we tell the stories? Are we as willing in our museums and our culture centers to talk about the things that we didn't do well, about our mistakes? I'm sorry? If it educates, that should be at the base of what we do. Because in talking about our mistakes, we allow people after us to learn. This is what we did, this is what happened, this is why it was a bad choice. How willing are we to be completely truthful? And how willing are we able to hear the truth about ourselves? Because as soon as we threaten a nation's self-image, it creates conflict. Now, Andreas Huyssen, as part of the dilemma we face in our curatorial objectives, is this search for the authentic then, the real story, in the midst of cultural ambiguity, where things are not certain, because this really does drive theory building process. That even in your own communities, that when you try an exhibit out, and then you evaluate it, how did people respond? you're building theory because you start to understand what issues actually cause people to react. What is really important in this country is that, and in many other parts of the world, particularly in nationalist museums, museums are assumed by their very nature of being public institutions, and for that matter, educational institutions, that no one goes to a museum and expects to be told a lie. It must be true. It was in the museum. It's real subtle. And that's why when you went to natural history museums in the late 19th century, and you would see the mastodon stuffed, and right next to it you'd see a stuffed Indian. Well, it wasn't a stuffed Indian, it was a diorama. And it must be true, there must have been Indians back then, but people had a hard time believing because you placed a stuffed Indian next to a mastodon. There aren't any today because the mastodons are extinct. It's real subtle, the way that people visually categorize information. People assume that there is some type of neutral framework. And that an objective story is being told. Not only a true story, but an objective one. There is no bias on the story you're being told. So the way we frame information, we use that word frame. I mean, it is a metaphor because we're not only putting the prints and the pictures and the paintings in frames, that we frame things in categories in our mind. That we often have a vision of the past as curators, as museum professionals, as well as museum goers, and a future that's based on what we need now. What we need to occur in a society today, we will often see a museum function to fulfill, because people aren't going to go unless you fulfill some need. And that includes at the very base just edutainment and escapism. You will see them in a most profound manner in new national museums. Any country that is building its first national museum, you are going to see the need for an identity. But it's going to be an identity that they have to show that there is this continuity of their existence that goes back even before the boundaries were carved up by a war. You'll find out that they want to show some type of connection to 1,000 generations before, as part of this continued sense of identity, to understand where they are now and, for that matter, plan where they're going to be. Because those needs do, in a real way, create boundaries. And ideological narrative. Ideological means there is a definite set of ideas, a definite set of truths, or so-called truths, that are being presented by that institution. So depending on where you are, when you go to the Museum of Natural History, you expect to see flora and fauna and old Indian stuff. One of my favorite museums still to go to is the American Museum of Natural History. They have an astounding collection of materials collected not only in this hemisphere but other parts of the world, of historic stuff. But I used to love to go to the dioramas. I just loved looking at Indians under glass. It used to just fascinate me. Not to look at the Indians under glass, but to look at people looking at Indians under glass and the assumptions they would make. Talking about Indians not even in the present tense anymore, as if they're not there. And if you're from Illinois, the only Indian you're going to know about is Chief Illinois for the Fighting Illini, which was a subject of intense controversy when Chartiters went to the University of Illinois and said, "What the hell are you doing here?" Because their idea of Indians was entirely different from the real thing, based on an icon. The Museum of Modern Art is a frame. And when you go into the Museum of Modern Art, you're going to expect a different presentation of art than you would in the Museum of Natural History, or the Chicago Field Museum, or the Louvre. The material is going to be presented differently because it has a different story to tell. Out of the Museum of Modern Art came what was called the white box. It's where, in essence, there is this box that surrounds an object. And it's pretty big. And that you give an object wall space so people perceive that painting and that painting alone. There will be nothing within your peripheral view to interfere with your perception of that work. You go into the Field Museum and there's going to be 50 pieces in the same amount of space. And none of them will have attribution of who they belong to or who made them. That even the type of museum we walk into, you go into the Holocaust Museum, you're not going to find much to laugh about. And you will see an entirely different presentation of materials in the Holocaust Museum than in the Natural History Museum. So, your objects and audience are actually framed in the presentation of materials in order to control the way that we perceive them, the way we view them. It has been an evolutionary development, even in the way that we present artists, because part of art history has been to present the artist as a genius, as a martyr even, as a hero, the artist's journey. In different societies, the frame is much larger than the object. It's the person's life, the person's story. And how willing are we to tell it? So if we were to extrapolate then